begin by welcoming everybody to the session on family and inequality in Asia. We have a relatively small group here, so there will hopefully be plenty of time for discussion after the talks. We have, I say, my name is Jim Ramo, as I said, and we have three fantastic colleagues, scholars from around the world who'll be presenting on family and inequality in Korea, China, and Singapore. So we're covering a wide range of territory. Before we get started, I should note a little bit of background and then a little bit of logistics. The background is that these papers, they're all independently produced, and they'll be pretty broad, I think, in scope, but all of them have emerged as part of a collaborative effort, an IUSSP scientific panel that's been working together over the past 3 or 4 years on family and inequality in East Asia and Southern Europe. And we don't have Southern Europe with us today. We've got to draw the line, excuse me, somewhere. And during that time, we've also come to realize how important and similar Singapore is to some of the East Asian countries that we've been studying. So we have included Jean and several of her colleagues in a very meaningful way in this project. There are many, many things that we're doing that I could tell you about, but this isn't the time or the place. Hopefully there will be a time and a place for that later. But with that, I should note that we will go in the order of the program. So that is Hyunjun Park, Jean Young, Jia Yu, and then me last. And the first two presentations by Hyunjun and Jean will be live. And since Jia and I went ahead and recorded ours, rather than presenting them again, we will just present the recordings for you, so you know how the program will be structured. And as I said, there should be 20 minutes or more at the end for hopefully a lively Q&A session. So with that, we will get things started. I would like to introduce Hyunjun Park, who is a professor of sociology and the director of the Kim program in Korean Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. Longtime colleague and friend, and I'm very happy that he is here to share his work on family change in Korea, South Korea. Thanks, Hyunjun.
Thanks, Jim. Okay, and also thanks for everyone who attended this meeting today. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about how Korean family has changed over the last couple of decades, and especially in which directions in terms of the educational difference in family behaviors. So let me start with some old image of Koreans, or in general, like East Asian family, that we often talked about without really, the questioning about the validity of those images nowadays. So in many cases, the Korean family was assumed like, were supposed to be, valuable to the vast majority, if not all. This idea about the universal family was supported by few family behavior. The first, the marriage was almost like universal. So except for a few, the vast majority got married. Although, again, someone got married earlier than others, but eventually by age, let's say, 45, we used to see that, the majority of the populations got married. Once forming family through marriage, couples tend to stay together. Again, although the quality of marriage varied, but still somehow, the couples used to, to keep the ties, basically for entire life. Here's, I think, I wanted to highlight that the marriage was the dominant way of forming family in South Korea. So cohabitation has not been any substantially any any functions as an alternative to the marriage at all. So the marriage was the kind of the dominant, predominant actually the way of forming family in South Korean context. And once you form the family through marriage, again, the couples tend to stay together. Married couple maintain close relationship with older parents and kept their children until later age. So this kind of the behaviors that, the universal marriage, low divorce rate, and strong family ties characterize Korean families as universal. So today, I'm going to ask the questions whether these Korean family is still universal in contemporary time? The reason I'm asking this question because I see some trends, so change in family behaviors in the last couple of decades. I see more and more people don't get married. Some of them are not able to, even if they want to. More and more couples break up, and more people, Koreans, actually tend to live alone. So those kind of the three major behaviors tend to suggest that maybe family is actually becoming less universal for at least some of the Korean populations. But I'm more interested about because these family changes happen not to everyone in the same degree, but more so for some than other groups. So even though this kind of the trends is generally seen for across many groups, but you will see that there's particularly some groups show just more evidence family change than others. So today I'm going to ask two questions: whether the family change happen more to people with more resource. Here's I'm actually thinking about the resource as represented by a high level of education. Do these family changes happen more to people with actually less resource, which represent by low level of education? So in this talk, I'd like to share some of my research that developed this issue about educational divisions in the family behaviors. I'm particularly focused on the three things about the family formation through marriage, how this delay or postpone of marriage actually happens for the differently across different groups. Second, family dissolutions. How these different education groups show the different pattern, different degree of the divorce over the time. Finally, I'd like to share a little bit about actually who live alone in South Korean context. Again, this strong family ties was a key element of the universal family, the image of the universal family in Korea. But as you can see that later, more and more Korean peoples tend to live alone, but particularly for some group than others, which tell us about the direction of the family change particularly in South Korean context. Throughout this different research, I use the same, educational category across years and cohort. So it's kind of the nominal education approach that we use same, the category over the years, even though, the educational distribution has changed over time. So I'll come back to this issue at the end of my talks about the implication of this, the using the same category as education. Let me first start with the marriage. The question is, are the highly educated more likely to get married than low educated? So there's been delay in marriage. As you can see here is that the mean age at first marriage in Korea, Japan, and the US for men in the left side and right side of women. As you can see that there's been quite substantial increase in the mean age at first marriage. So in 1990s, Korea was actually about men was 28, but now it's almost 33, at the mean age at first marriage in 2015. Women also showed quite substantial increase in the age in first, the mean age at first marriage. However, this kind of delay in marriage did not happen uniformly across different educational groups. So let me present one kind of very interesting, the figure, simplest figure, but tell us about how this delay in marriage has occurred differently for different educational group. So this is the proportion of 40 to 44 years old who are ever married in Korea in 1995. For men, and this right side is about women. As you can see, almost everyone got married, 95, 96, 97% of men were ever married by age of 44. And if there's any, the difference across education, probably lowest educated men were less likely to get married, but almost the difference is just very tiny. Same for women, almost again, 95.7% across different level of education were married in 1995. If there's any relationship between education and ever married, in among women, we see that some of the negative relationships. So the highly educated women were less likely to get married by age of 44. But again, the difference was very tiny. And this kind of the really consistent with the idea about the universal marriage in South Korea. What happened after 20 years, just 2 decades, not even 3 decades, 2 decades, what happened? This is what happened. For this blue bar, which is indicate the lowest level of education, who have less than high school education, only half of men get ever married by age 44, which is almost like the really dramatic decline in the proportion of marriage by this the age group in just 2 decades, right? And also as you can see that even high school graduate now is only 70% of them were married by age 44. Of course, some of them will get married even after age 44, but you can imagine that probably many of them will actually remain, unmarried for entire, their life. Oops. Even though the degree of the declining among women is less than men, but you can also see the very similar pattern. One exception is actually among the highly educated women, also, the decline than middle of the education. So you don't see much clear education gradient yet among women, but still the basic patterns are similar, which indicate this lowest men and women now is one of the group actually who are less likely to get married by age 44 in South Korean context. So this clearly tells us that maybe marriage is no longer universal, but particularly among those low educated men and women. This is a kind of the same finding, but based on the cohort approach rather than period. So this is the proportion of the single, who remain unmarried by age and education, and the old cohort who were born 1946 to 55. So this, the line indicate university graduate, and this line indicate high school graduate, and this is less than high school graduate. As you can see that the college graduate men remain unmarried until age 30, 31, but they catch up eventually. So eventually they are actually more likely to get married by age 39. But as you can see that this gap is pretty small among old cohort. So even though there was some, the delay in marriage among the college educated men, the difference between this college and lower college educated, no college educated men was very small. But after 20 years later, who are born in 20 years later, again, another 2 decades, you can see this dramatic change. Now, red line indicates university graduate. And this blue line indicate the men without high school education. Again, this is very similar to what we just saw, that almost half of them will remain single by age 39. So the gap between low educated and high educated in terms of the remaining single is now much, much larger than in old cohort. So this is kind of the story where marriage has become much, the less, that happens among those low educated compared to the, the college educated folks. So let me summarize for the marriage. The rapid decline in marriage is more evident among the low educated than high educated. So marriage, especially the marriage is, given that marriage is a major form of the family formation, it is increasingly difficult to achieve among the least educated. Let me move on to divorce. So the question is again whether these highly educated folks will stay together, more likely to stay together than low educated couple. The reason why I'm interested about this issue, because there has been a rapid increase in divorce rate. So this is a crude divorce rate, just simply number of divorce per thousand population. So it doesn't tell us really good indication, but still it's a useful, especially comparative perspective. By 2003, as you can see, this divorce rate, crude divorce rate, Korea is relatively higher than many of even European country. Of course, this European country have probably more cohabitation. So again, it's not directly compatible, but it just tells us about how the speed of the divorce has rapid during the 90s, then a little bit actually declined after this peak in 2003. But this increase in divorce has not been uniform across all these education group again. So I will just skip. So this is actually the divorce rate for this for the different educational group for men and women. As you can see, this blue line is less than high school education. Red, orange line is a high school graduate, and this, the gray line is indicate the college educate. As you can see, generally the divorce rate has increased over the all three educational group, but particularly among low educate group for both men and women. So the rapidly increased divorce is now more evident for the low educate than the high educate. And it is increasingly difficult for the low educate to maintain marriage relative to their highly educated counterpart. Remember that these low educated folks have increasingly difficult to form a family through marriage. So if now you don't have education in South Korean context, you are much have a hard time to form a family for the first time as through the marriage. But even if you actually form a marriage through marriage, you are much more likely to deserve your marriage compared to your higher educated counterpart. Let me finally, share the one kind of interesting finding from my particularly from my perspective, which is about the living alone among those widowed elderly. Again, given this availability of the family, we expect this, the widows actually live together with their children or someone else. But in South Korean context, as you can see here, is that actually the percentage of Korean who live alone has increased quite substantially for across all age group, but particularly this among 65 plus widowed only. As you can see that almost half of widows now in Korean context live alone, not with their children, not with anyone else, just live by themselves. So this kind of the trend, however, is also not uniform, but the more substantial among low educated folks rather than highly educated folks. So interesting enough, these low educated folks are much more likely to live alone than highly educated folks, especially among these widowed, in Korean context. So given the time, let me summarize then actually to finish quickly as possible. So the rapid increase in the share of Koreans who live alone, but this increase is even more evident among the low educated. So that the highly educated are actually more likely to live with someone else like as family members. So all these, the family change in family behaviors in Korea, to tell us about the how the Korean families has evolved over the last 2 decades. These trends happens together for both low and highly educated. However, educational differential in family behaviors are diverged over time. So that we can see that the low educated are increasingly less likely to form a family through marriage, increasingly more likely to end a family, and also increasingly more likely to live alone, particularly when they need, which is indicate family becomes a luxury for these low educated folks in contemporary Korea. So I will stop here. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Hyunjung, for this. I'm always amazed at the rapidity of change in family outcomes and patterns in South Korea. Again, I'm sure people have questions for Hyunjung, but let's hold on to them till we're done with all four of the talks. And you'll see they're all closely related, so we can have a good sort of comprehensive discussion at the end. So next, it's my pleasure to introduce my colleague and friend, Professor Jean Young, who is a professor of sociology at the National University of Singapore, where she is also the founding director of the Center for Family and Population Research, which I'm sure many of you know. It's a real hub of family demographic research in Asia. So Jean, take it away. You're muted.
All right. Thank you, Jim, for including me in this session, and good morning or good evening, depending on where you are. In this talk, we're going to be talking about the implications of changing demographic behavior for young children, very young children, and we're focused on Singapore. The title of this talk is Path at the Starting Gate Through Time Use. And it's a collaborative work with Jion Lee. Our research question is, how do family socioeconomic characteristics shape young children's time use patterns in Singapore, which is a very diverse socioeconomically and culturally society. And through this, we would like to shed light on the implications of intergenerational transmissions of inequality in Singapore. We're going to be focusing on time use in early childhood. Why do we care about time use in early childhood? Because how children spend their time before they attend school, kind of at the age of 0 to 5, affects their early development and may have significant long-term implications for their later development, as literature has shown. Early childhood is a critical period in all developmental studies, science that we know about, which is characterized by high plasticity in the brain. And the development of the brain promotes developmental adaptation in various regions, and it brings lifelong benefits. So, we have identified some gaps in children's time use studies. Most of the studies focus on children's time after, for older children. Studies before school is kind of limited. And people also looked at parents' time, sometimes by themselves, mother and father, sometimes parents together, the time used for children, which is usually a total and does not, it's difficult to relate to each particular child's outcome. A lot of people also use stylized questions, which is known to be less reliable than time use studies. And most studies in this area also focus on, conducted in Europe or America. Few studies were done in Asian contexts, where we see different demographic and behavior patterns. So how is Singapore unique? As in South Korea, where Han-Jun has presented, it had one of the most rapid demographic transition in the world. The TFR declined from 4.7, almost 5 in 1965 when Singapore became an independent society, a country. In a matter of 10 years, in 1975, it had dropped down to replacement fertility. And now it's among the lowest in the world, with total fertility rate of 1.1 last year. I think we're higher than South Korea, but it's also one of the lowest in the world. The reason why such a rapid transition occurred is because of these very compressed marginalization in income. The country moved from a third world country to a first world country in a matter of 3 decades. And now is one of the richest country in the world in terms of per capita GDP. The similar things happen in education, urbanization, and globalization. Other demographic behaviors are similar, but at different speed, actually, from South Korea. You also see late marriage and low marriage rates. However, different from the second demographic transition, there is a few births outside of the wedlock, and that is because the law does not legitimize such birth. We also see, I believe it's much lower than Japan and South Korea, and relatively low divorce rate, again, lower than other East Asian countries, other than maybe similar to with China. And there's a trend of increased educational or sortative marriages that we want to focus on in this paper. There's also a very heavy emphasis on education for social mobility. And the country has a multiracial cultural background, with Chinese being a majority, but we also have Malay, Indians, and other groups. But this is not going to be one of my focus in this talk. Just a very quick look at how the education attainment, especially female enrollment ratio in tertiary education in a matter of 4 or 5 decades had increased from 4 to 95.4, again, one of the highest, like South Korea, in the whole world. And that pattern is what we're talking about in this, in the midst of demographic transition, one of the socioeconomic changes that is very significant that affect many of the family well-being. The trend of a sortative marriage that I talked about, comparing 2009 to 2019, you can see that there's larger proportion of couples that are both university degree. And the two slides, there's two sections that have couples with two different educational levels have decreased to less than 1/3. Particularly this traditionally conventional type of marriage where the groom have higher education than the bride has declined to less than 14%. So in this kind of trend, social polarization can potentially increase for family, but here we focus on children's well-being. In this context of couples having very few children, but focus on quality and education a lot, starting from early childhood when children are very young. So again, to recap, our research question is to look at how socioeconomic characteristics affect very young children's time use pattern in Singapore. A few words about time diary methods. That is the way of collecting data from midnight of one day to midnight of another day, asking each child for one particular day. And in this study, we have one weekday and one weekend day. What do children do from the midnight to the next day, as I say, 24 hours day? How much time they spend on the activity, where the children, where the child was, and who was doing that activity with the child, and who else was doing that activity with the child. Time diary, as I said, that is shown to have been more reliable than the stylized question because attitude and norms can influence the response to a stylized question a lot more than it is when time is structured in a 24-hour day. And this kind of social desirability bias is often much decreased in time diary data. The data set we use is a new data set called Singapore Longitudinal Early Development Study, short for SGMEETS. And it's a study that I lead, and it's with many of my other colleagues. The study now has 2 waves. We just finished second wave, so much of the presentation will be based on the first data from the first wave that was collected in 2018 to 19 before the pandemic time. The study cover is a national multi-level stage probability sample of more than 5,000 Singapore children across the country, and was properly representing age and different gender, age from 0 to 6, and then race, as I say, these multiracial groups here. The children's time diaries were collected from the primary caregiver of this target child, and it's used with CAPI during a face-to-face interview. It's most of the reporters of the time diaries are mother. And in this study, we focused on children who were born and live with both mother and father. Because, as I say, the divorce rate is relatively low in Singapore, and it particularly when children were still young at the age of under age 6. So there isn't enough variability in the data for us to look at, intact family versus other kind of single parent family and so on. All these activities get coded, hundreds of them get coded into large categories and with different categories of data. We're going to focus in this talk in 4 types of selected activities as our dependent variables. First is electronic device use that include watching TV and other device use, achievement-oriented activities like reading, singing, playing musical instrument, puzzles, studying children, and so on. Sports, active play activities that include organized activities, active plays, exercises, and so on. And then school daycare lessons, because these are shown to be more has implications on the cognitive development of children in the literature. So our key independent variables of socioeconomic characteristic of the family, of the parents, one is education, and we choose here to use parental education level, a combined measure of both mother and father to try to reflect the trend of assortated marriages from both couples are low and mid is defined up here. Mothers is higher than father, father is higher than mother, both mid-range and both high education, that is actually higher. We also look at the quartiles of family income and also mother's work status here. So a bit of results of the time use dependent variables. As I say, we have weekday and a weekend day of each child spent on these 4 different kind of activities. And kids spent about an hour. And remember, these are young children. An hour on weekday and more an hour and 38 minutes on a weekend day, about half an hour on achievement-oriented activities, and 20 minutes on weekday on sports and other active activities, and more on weekends. And on weekdays, they spend 5 hours in school daycares and private lessons. And almost none in weekend day. So these are kind of the descriptive data that actually we've validated the reliability and validity of the data. And for the multivariate analysis, we conducted both Tobit and OLS analysis. Both of them are very similar analysis. And here we're presenting the Tobit marginal effect of these results. First, the media time by parents' education level. As I say, I'm going to focus on the parents' education, and focusing on couples, parents who have both low education and both high education level because of time constraints. You can see that TV and other electronic device time combined to an hour and 42 minutes on a weekday. And that is more than an hour than children who have parents who have high education. And on weekend day, the difference is even bigger than a weekend day, than a weekday here. As you can see here, more than an hour and 10 minutes apart. The middle three groups don't have a lot of differences. Here is the time they spend in achievement-oriented time activities. Again, similar patterns and gradients that you've seen, 21 minutes versus 35 minutes in the two extreme categories of assorted of the parental education combination. Again, bigger difference on weekend days here. And multivariate analysis controlling for other variables. Here you can see that on a weekday, actually both high, the reference group is both low group. The both high group spent less than half an hour, 32 minutes less on electronic device, almost 20 minutes more on cognitive activities, and more time, about 10 minutes, on sports and other active activities. And let me skip that because of time constraints. And for the household income, you can see that the fourth quarter, the highest income group also spent more on cognitive related activities than the lowest group and the other groups too. And they also spent more time on sports and active activities. On a weekend day, as I say, the difference is even bigger. 40 minutes here and 23 minutes here for cognitive achievement related activity, 18 minutes more for the sports, and for income, it's we're looking at 1 day difference of more than half an hour and less in electronic device, and 20 minutes more in active activities, and so on. So there's some other differences that are cultural that I won't focus on, but you can see that culture is very important too. Compared to Chinese group, the Malays, Chinese children spend a lot more time on schools, lessons, daycare, and much less time on electronic devices, and so on. So in summary, we're seeing very large gaps. What I have shown you is per day, 1 day, 1 weekday and 1 weekend day. But these kind of differences accumulate to be very large difference over a week. We're talking about over a week. The low educational children in parents, families with parents who have both low education group, spend 4 hours or more in electronic devices and almost 2.5 hours less in achievement oriented, and about 1 hour and 20 minutes less in sports and other activities. So times that to 1 year. Okay, that's huge differences. And these differences are shown to be continue to increase as children get older. And let me skip that. Implication is that Singapore children are spending much more time than what WHO has recommended on electronic device, and much less time on what WHO has recommended on active activities. And that, of course, is not good news. In particular, children from disadvantaged group, as I shown you, has spent so much more screen time and less time on active activities and achievement-oriented activities. And these are only going to increase as children grow. That's why we're looking at how these divergent paths for children looking at age 0 to 5, 0 to 6, and in this paper likely to continue as children enter school and grow older. So implication, I think I'm running out of time. We can talk about this later, but basically this were contributed to a polarized society through this divergent pattern of intergenerational transfer of resources to children, in this case, through time. And in other papers, we have seen that other resources, like monetary kind of resources, show the same pattern. Worse yet, we have some preliminary result on the impact of COVID-19 that has shown that the most disadvantaged children are most hardest hit by the pandemic, and the children are spending more time, even more time on electronic activities, devices, and less time, even less time on, active and sports activities, and they're less adequate in achievement learning, home-based care learning. So after the pandemic, later in the future, we'll have some more data to show that, but I think that pattern is pretty clear at this point. And let me stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jean. I always am amazed at the amount of information that is included in the SG Leads. So again, save questions for Jean for later. And bear with us here right now. Anna is going to put up the talk by Jia Yu, who I'm very happy to introduce. Jia is an assistant professor at the Center for Social Research at Peking University, and is doing all kinds of fascinating work on family change, inequality, second demographic transition, and so on in China. So I think that Anna will put up her video, because we've, as I said, already recorded these. And I think Hanjun, Jean, Jia, all of us need to turn off our video so that it shows up well for the others in the audience.
Hello, everyone. I'm Jia Yu, an assistant professor from Peking University, and I'm happy to be part of the Family and Inequality in Asia session. And I will introduce the marital behavior and childbearing among Chinese youth. The motivation of my study is very simple. We know Chinese family is experiencing transitions, and the traditional family culture, the function like economic production and elder care has all been largely eroded in China. And another prominent phenomenon of China's family transition is the low fertility. According to the 2020 census, the total fertility rate in China has declined to 1.3, signaling that China has gradually stepped into the lowest low fertility country. China is also experiencing the second demographic transition, although with some variations from the second demographic transition in the European countries. But we can still observe some significant changes, family changes associated with the SDT, such as delayed marriage age, increased cohabitation rate, and so on. However, little research has primarily focused on the younger generation in China. So for those young people in China, on the one hand, they grow up in an era of rapid economic development, and they are largely influenced by the internet. But on the other hand, they are also the generation of the only child of their natal family. So we may expect some further changes in their union formation and childbearing behavior, as well as their family attitudes. In addition, in this study, I also want to explore the heterogeneity of family behaviors among the young people, especially in terms of the social-economic differentials. Before proceeding to the empirical part, I will first introduce the past, briefly introduce the past and the present of family in China. So in traditional Chinese society, family is placed ultimate importance. So that's why we can observe early and universal marriage, and as well as very high fertility rate. And finally, those premarital behaviors like premarital sex behavior, divorce, and marital childbirth, and those behaviors are stigmatized and are strictly forbidden. But in recent decades, some social changes may reshape the family in China. First, women's social economic status has been largely improved. And according to the recent data, the young women's educational level have surpassed that of men. And because of the weakened patriarchy, individuals in China nowadays, they are less restricted by the family and the community. And after 2000, a sexual revolution also happened in China. And nowadays, people are holding more liberal attitudes towards premarital sex behavior. The legal system also changed. For example, the wording of cohabitation in marriage law in China before 2001 was illegal cohabitation, but after 2001, they were changed to non-marital cohabitation. Chinese people, especially the young generation, they are largely influenced by the Western culture, including the books, the movies, as well as direct interaction with the foreigners. Lastly, family planning policy, which was implemented since 1979, right? It has fundamentally changed Chinese people's attitudes towards childbearing. So to look at how the social changes affect family in China, I tend to examine two dimensions of family. The first is marital behavior, and the second is childbearing. So in terms of the marital behavior, I will first examine marriage and the marriage rate, the marriage age. Also, I will examine the ideal marriage age among the young people, and also something about the voluntary singlehood. And I will also examine the attitudes towards family or towards marriage in China. I will also look at the cohabitation in China. According to my previous study, cohabitation in China is primarily follow the second demographic transition pattern. It means that cohabitation is more prevalent among those is more prevalent among those with higher socioeconomic status. But as cohabitation become more and more prevalent in today's China, whether it will shift from the SDT pattern to the pattern of disadvantage is still a question open to be answered. And we also examine the SES differentials of divorce, right, among Chinese people. So in terms of the childbearing, I will first examine the behavior, the timing, and having a second child in China because of the relaxation of family planning policy in 2016. And I will also examine the fertility attitudes, including ideal number of children, as well as other ideologies. The data I used for this study is China Family Panel Studies in 2018, and it includes very detailed information about attitudes and the behaviors related to marriage, cohabitation, divorce, and childbearing. I divided my sample into 4 birth cohorts, and I also divided my sample into 5 educational level, with the lowest one as the primary school or below, and the highest one is 4-year college and above. And the hukou and migration is also another very important attribute of Chinese people. So I divide my sample into 3 groups. One is the rural hukou holders who live in rural areas. The second one is urban hukou holders who live in urban areas. And the last one is the migrant workers who have rural hukou but live in urban areas. Then let's look at my results. First, let's look at the marriage timing. So according to the survival curve, we can see that both men and the women, right, in China, they have postponed their timing of entering marriage, right? And now we can see that for the elder generation, right, a certain proportion of men will remain single after 40 years old, maybe about 5%. And for those born after 1990, only 1/3 of men and only half of women will enter marriage before 25 years old. Right? This is a general picture. Then let's look at the survival curve by both birth cohort and educational level. So for men, right, for the upper ones, we can see that for men, especially those born after 1970, right, those men with the lowest level of education or lower socioeconomic potential, they were largely excluded from the marriage market, and a large proportion of them, maybe 15% of them, will remain single even by the age of 40, and they may remain lifelong single. And for women, for those born before 1970, we can see that the women with highest level of education, the pink lines, right, women with 4-year college or above, about 10% of them will remain single by the age of 40 because of the mismatch in the marriage market. And it's very hard for those highly educated women to find a matched partner in the marriage market. But we can see the trend has been changed, right, as time goes by. So for those born in 1970s, and the singlehood rate for those women with the highest level of education, 4-year college and above, is becoming lower. And for those women born after 1980s, right, born in 1980s, we can see that the effect of having a higher education has been changed a lot, right? And now those women with higher education is no longer a problem for them to find a partner, right? So we may observe a reversing effect of higher education on women's marriage likelihood among those among the younger generation. And then the third figure is about the proportion of unmarried men and women who are not willing to marry. So it's an indicator of voluntary singlehood. So we can see that for those people in their early or late 20s, and less than 3% of them are not willing to marry, which is much lower than other Asian countries like Japan and South Korea. And even for those teenagers, we can see that less than 4% of them are not willing to marry. So because of this, right, we can see the singlehood rate in China is mainly because of the involuntary singlehood, right? They were expelled from the marriage market, or hard for them to find a matched partner. But because of this proportion, we may expect that in the near future, right, the voluntary singlehood rate in China may not increase very, very quickly, right? So the singlehood in China will still be primarily the involuntary singlehood. And this figure is about the ideal age of first marriage for unmarried men and the women. So we can see that for those teenagers as well as those people in their 20s, and the ideal marriage age is not that late. It's between 25 and 30, right? So even with some postponement, the marriage age in China may not reach the level in Japan and Korea because of this in the near future, may not exceed 30 years old. And I also examined the attitudes towards family. So here, the respondents will ask about the importance of having happy family, intimacy with spouse, and I also choose 2 other indicators relevant to individual life. One is having interesting life, another is the sense of achievement. So we can see that having a happy family is very important, even among the younger generation. They even have attached higher importance towards having happy family. And the intimacy, right, with spouse is less important compared with having a happy family, right, especially for the elder generation. But if we look at the trend, we may see that Chinese family is changing towards the couple-centered family. The intimacy with spouse become more and more important. But in general, if we compare the importance of having interesting life and the sense of achievement, we can see they are still less important than having a happy family. So Chinese people still value family a lot. So then let's look at the cohabitation in China. So we can see the cohabitation rate just increased all along time. So for those born in late 1980s, and the cohabitation rate exceed or reach 40%, right? And if we look at the distribution of premarital cohabitation rate by the cohort and other variables, first we can see for those born before 1970s, or even those born in 1970s, we can generally observe a SDT pattern of cohabitation. Usually, especially for men, those with higher educational level, they will have higher premarital cohabitation rate. But for those born in 1980s, especially those born in 1990s, the pattern has changed a lot, right? So we can see for both men and the women born between 1990 to 1994. So I restrict the sample to that age so that they can reach 25, or they can complete college education by 2018. But still we can see those young people, right, born between 1990 to 1994, those people with junior high school, they tend to have the highest rate, premarital cohabitation rate. It seems that cohabitation in China is changing from the SDT pattern to the POD pattern. Similarly for the hukou and the migration. So among the youngest cohort, those people, right, those migrant people, migrant women, right, they began to have the highest cohabitation rate. And for the men, those rural young people, they tend to have the highest cohabitation rate. So the third dimension I will look at is divorce. So in general, we can see there is a increase of divorce rate in China. But if we look at the magnitude of divorce rate in China, we can see generally for those married between 2000 and 2009, the 10-year divorce rate is less than 5%. And the 20-year or 15-year divorce rate is less than 10%. So general, although we can observe an increase, but the general divorce rate in China is not that high. And if we look at the social economic differentials of divorce, we didn't observe a linear pattern. We observe a non-linear pattern, and those people with the junior high school or senior high school, college, they tend to have the highest divorce rate. So the last part is about childbearing. So we can see that Chinese people or Chinese women, they postpone their timing of childbearing, but the magnitude is not that large, right? And also we can observe universal childbearing, right, for women. And this is the average number of childbirths. So we can see, in general, we can observe a declining number of childbirths, and also those women with higher education, those women with urban hukou, they tend to have lower fertility rate. And if we look at the second childbirths for Chinese women, we can see that for those born in 1980s, more than half of them have already given birth to the second child. And for those born in 1990s, right, and almost 20% of them have already given birth to the second child. But if we conditional on already having birth to the giving birth to the first child, more than 1/3 of those born in 1990s, they have already given birth to the second child. So the relaxation of the family planning policy in China, it just to some extent encouraged the childbirths in China. And this is about the distribution of an average of ideal number of children. So we can see generally for the younger generation, the ideal number of children is below replacement level, very, very low, only 1.7. And also is lower among those people with relatively higher education. And if we look at the attitudes of fertility ideologies, right, of men, Chinese men and the women, we can see generally the importance of continuing bloodline for women is become less important over time. But for men, it is still very important. But having promising children, right, the importance attached to this indicator is still very, very high. We can see for both men and women, they attach very high importance, more than 4.5 on average. But for the youngest cohort, and maybe they have already changed a little bit towards the childbearing. And although it's still very high, but we can observe a decline for both men and women in terms of the importance of having promising children. So to have a quick summary, first, we can see that the marriage is delayed in China, but still in China, we have very, very low voluntary singlehood rate. And a large new finding is that we observe a reversing effect of higher education for women in marriage entry. And for cohabitation, it seems that China is transitioning from the SDT to POD pattern. So for divorce, it is increased over time, but we didn't observe a linear relationship with SES, right? We observe a non-linear relationship. So for the childbearing, Chinese people now have a very, very small ideal family size. But it seems that the family is still child-centered, although it's changing towards the couple-centered, and people still place very high expectation on children's future and achievement. So that's all of my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jia, for that very comprehensive overview. I want to make sure that we have some time for questions, so I'm not really going to introduce myself other than to say that this is going to be very similar territory covered by Hanjun, Jean, and Jia, except in Japan. So I'll ask Anna if she can put my slides up, and I'll apologize to the audience that's with us for the low resolution. I don't think there's much we can do about that. So one more, and then we'll have time for Q&A. Okay, this is the session on family and inequality in Asia. My name is Jim Ramo from Princeton University, and I will be talking about family change and inequality in Japan within the framework of diverging destinies. So just to get started, I put together a little slide here that presents just a very small handful of the many, many, many general audience books that are that have been published in recent years in Japan, focusing on family change, growing social inequality, children's poverty, growing inequality in children's well-being, for example. The point I want to make here is that this is a very high-profile issue, a hot topic, if you will, both within the world of social science research, but also the policy world, and certainly there's a broad social understanding that this is a major issue. What's surprising to me as a family demographer is that despite the vast amount of attention that has been devoted to family change and inequality, children's well-being, almost none of it is explicitly framed within the context of diverging destinies. This, of course, for the family demographers among you, certainly those who work in the United States, is something that will be very familiar. A very compelling, widely used framework for understanding family change and inequality that has emerged from the work of Sarah McClanahan and others. So just to make sure we're all on the same page, I've produced this little stylized representation of family change and inequality within the Diverging Destinies framework. And it's really quite simple. We are interested in family change. So the vertical axis here is the percent of women or families, mothers, experiencing some family event. Let's just say, for example, here it is non-marital childbearing. And the idea is that at earlier points in time, closer to the origin here, there are relatively limited socioeconomic differences in this outcome. We can see here that the red line is low SES mothers, middle SES is yellow, and high SES is black. SES is typically measured in this work using educational attainment, but obviously it could be measured in other ways as well. But the basic idea here, as I said, is that differentials are relatively limited in the early, at some earlier point in time, and those differentials grow over time. Here we see a relatively rapid increase in this case, this fictional case, non-marital childbearing among low SES mothers, much faster than we see among those in the middle and higher groups. The key point to keep in mind here is that the family events or family change that we are interested in are things that are empirically or theoretically related to children's resources. So the pattern that we observe here would map on to growing differentials in the resources available to children, hence to growing inequality, more intergenerational transmission of disadvantage or advantage, as the case may be. We talked about my fictional example here was non-marital childbearing, but really in the Diverging Destinies literature, there is a focus on any kind of family behavior that we think is related to children's resources. Early versus late marriage here, cohabitation versus marriage, and so on. I'm not going to go through all of these examples here, but the point is that if it's related to children's resources, either empirically or theoretically, this is something that is important to the notion of diverging destinies. And as I said, this really hasn't been part of the conversation in Japan, and I can think of some reasons why it hasn't. We can talk about those later. But what I really want to think about is what can we learn if we do bring this framework to a study of family change and inequality in Japan. And for those of us who work in one country, the United States in my case, but on another country, often this is what we're interested in, right? Trying to bring widely used, widely understood frameworks to other contexts and to leverage distinctive features of those contexts to try to understand something more about how specific features of context alter or not our understanding of how the underlying processes of interest may play out. So that's really what we're interested in here. Context-specific insights or inferences that allow for contextual modification of the broader diverging destinies framework. And in the Japanese case, I think there's a lot to be gained from this kind of application. A few years ago, a colleague, a very close colleague of mine, Miho Iwasawa, and I prepared a small manuscript that talked about the reasons why we might expect the notion of diverging destinies to be actually of relatively little relevance in Japan, including rather extreme gender inequality, limited variation in career paths for married women, history of a relatively homogeneous family life course, but also strong reasons to expect diverging destinies to be of real relevance as it is in the US and other countries, including a weak safety net and a rapidly changing labor market, particularly the growth of bad jobs or non-standard employment in Japan. So with that context, what I'd like to do here is not to give you the results or share the results of a single paper, but rather to sort of cast a wide net and talk a little bit about the findings from a whole range of studies that I have done with colleagues in recent years to think about what we know from that work within this broader framework of diverging destinies. So I'm going to start with a paper that was published a couple of years ago in the Journal of Marriage and Family with my colleagues Setsuya Fukuda and Shohei Yoda. And basically what we show here is for women on the left and men on the right, interesting patterns in marriage. So marriage is typically not something that we think about in the context of the diverging destinies framework. We think about non-marital childbearing or childbearing within marriage, but let's just think about marriage as a good in this case, and in the Japanese context, I think that that's reasonable. But what we see here is really interesting. Let's look at the right-hand side, for example, men. We see that the red line, those men in the lowest educational group, are increasingly differing from those in higher educational groups in terms of the propensity of ever marrying. The decline in the likelihood of ever marrying for this group is particularly rapid relative to men in the higher education groups. And what's really exciting and interesting to us as scholars of family change is that we see something similar happening in very recent years for women in Japan, where those in the lowest group are increasingly less likely to ever marry in a kind of synthetic cohort sense than those in higher educational groups, which is something really quite new in Japan. And again, I want to highlight that this isn't directly related to the notion of diverging destinies. I'm going to get to that, but I think it is really adjacently relevant, if you'll forgive that probably inappropriate English, in that it demonstrates that there is something fundamental happening with respect to the link between socioeconomic status and family formation in the Japanese context. Here's another example that is in that manuscript that I mentioned that I published with Miho Iwasawa. And here the outcome is bridal pregnancy. So that is marrying subsequent to pregnancy, what we used to call shotgun marriages in the United States, dekichatta-kon in the Japanese context. And what we see here, looking at different birth cohorts separated by educational attainment, is that the red line, let's ignore the blue line right now, that's the lowest educated, a very unusual group. But let's look at the red and the gray lines, the high school and vocational school graduates. Much more rapid increase for this group than for those in higher educational groups. And to the extent that bridal pregnancy, marriage subsequent to pregnancy, is more likely to be an unintended pregnancy, perhaps followed by a more unstable marriage. This is something that we think may be related to children's resources and is completely consistent with that stylized pattern that I showed you earlier. Here's another example for a from a paper that we are working on right now and that is being presented in another session here at the World Congress. And this shows married women's pathways to marriage in Japan. First married women by education, high school, junior college, university graduates from left to right. And the combination, this is the different colored boxes represent different pathways to marriage, with the blue being the sort of conventional pathway. No cohabitation, no premarital pregnancy, straight to marriage. And you can see that that's more common among the highly educated. Not even half of the least educated follow that conventional pathway. A quarter of the lowest educated experience bridal pregnancy, compared to only 11% of the highest educated. Over 30% in all groups experience cohabitation in one form or another, but this is again higher among the lower educated than among the highly educated. I'm not going to spend time on this, but this is just a montage here of front pages of several papers that I have published with colleagues over the past several years, looking at educational differences in single motherhood and the implications for children's well-being. Again, what we see is that single motherhood via divorce is strongly associated with lower educational attainment. And in some other papers, we've demonstrated how this is related to women's own happiness, their children's educational attainment, educational performance, I should say, children's health, and so on. So again, there is evidence consistent with this pattern of diverging destinies in the Japanese context. Here, educational experiences, differences in experience of divorce for educational groups, and this is in a recent survey. This is work that's recently been published with a colleague, Jia Wang, a graduate student at the University of Wisconsin. Basically here we show the percent ever divorced is much, much higher among those at the lower end of the educational distribution than at the higher end. Again, consistent with what we just showed a minute ago. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip this one. This is just a slide showing mothers' economic disadvantage. So 3 groups here, vocational, junior college, and university graduates, all have lower levels of economic disadvantage relative to those in the high school group, the lowest educated group. 4 different measures of economic disadvantage. And here's what happens when we account for educational differences in divorce and unstable employment around childbearing. It explains about 1/3 of this difference. So about 1/3 of the difference in educational attainment, relationship between mother's educational attainment and economic disadvantage is accounted for, in a statistical sense at least, by their different patterns of family behavior, particularly divorce and unstable employment. So just a couple of last minute slides. I realize I'm already over time. Again, collaborative work with Jia Wang basically shows here that again, we're using income tertiles or quartiles rather than educational attainment. But this just shows that school performance is higher among children of the more highly educated or higher earning mothers. And we see that behavioral problems are higher among those with mothers at the lower end of the income distribution. So the point I guess I'm trying to make here is that we're casting a wide net, trying to learn as much as we can about differences in family behavior, differences in child well-being, and differences in the linkage between family behavior and child well-being to better understand the relevance of this diverging destinies framework in the Japanese context. I'm going to skip over this and basically say that we're trying to, where do we go next, right? So we're trying to expand this to think about this in the East Asian context more broadly. Korea, China, Taiwan, we are working on a paper, working with my colleagues Hanjun Park and Jia Yu on this as well. Trying to think not just about single family behaviors, but a whole constellation of family behaviors, because I think that there are some distinctive aspects of the broader pattern of family formation and dissolution in the East Asian context that distinguishes it from the US or other Western countries in ways that may help us to understand better what's going on. And what we really want to do is to try to make a more direct link between family behavior and children's outcomes. This is something that is partially visible in the Diverging Destinies research, but in our view, merits much more attention, explicit attention. So I realize I'm over time. I hope this was at least helpful in giving you a sense of what's out there and how we're thinking about trying to bring this notion of diverging destinies to the Japanese and the more broadly, the East Asian context. Thank you for your attention. Okay, let's see. There we are. Thank you, everybody. I realize there are not many of you left. And we didn't do very well with time. I apologize for that. But we do have a little bit of time, about 10, 12 minutes for questions. And there already is one question in the queue from Daniel, who I see is thankfully still here with us. So Anna, if you could let Daniel unmute and show himself to us, that would be great.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, perfect.
I'm in my laundry room here. It's all clean laundry, don't worry. Yeah, I have this was a terrific panel. I have questions for everybody on the panel, actually, but I don't want to hog all the time. So maybe I'll just repeat the one to Hyunjun. And I think maybe the answer came after Jim gave his presentation, because I remember in 1994, I went to Seoul and there was this big conference. There was great interest in sex selection that was starting in the world around that time. And at the time, South Korea had the highest sex ratios at birth in the world. So I'm thinking of that cohort starting in maybe late 80s, early 90s. And I thought maybe the shortage of females because of sex selection could maybe explain why, because of you know this already, you read the question, whether that could relate to that. But then I saw Jim's presentation and it looks like it's happening in Japan too. And there's no sex selection there. So it looks like my hypothesis is wrong. Am I right that I'm wrong?
No, I think that's a great question. Actually, I think, maybe yes and no. I mean, to some extent, because I do actually think that's some, the possibility there. Like, I haven't looked at carefully about to what extent, but certainly there was actually, this, the sex imbalance at the core. But another factor that I think is a matter is, in fact, Jim and I look at this issue because, very strong educational monogamy country, South Korea, and women tend to marry with the same level of education, or actually, hypergamy, so that women tend to marry up in terms of education. But there was a dramatic expansion of education for both women and men in South Korea. So the women don't have actually men who have less than, tend to have now more education than men. So that actually these men who with the lowest level of education actually left out in the marriage market. So there is a very squeeze of this labor marriage market among those low educated men who can find a woman who tend to marry either same level of education or marry up. So in fact, one thing that we found, Jim, and in our, myself, demography paper, interesting enough, because these low educated men in Korea actually have a hard time to find a potential partner, there's some international migration help them actually to get married, in fact. So, lots of women now actually, coming from South Asia and China and so on, but most of those women actually marry with these low educated men. So in fact, what you see is kind of underestimate if there was no international migration. So almost 10 percentage point, we found that actually is explained by, the international migration to South Korea, who actually married to, those low educated men.
Okay. Thanks.
Thanks, Daniel and Hyunjun. So there's only three others of you here that have stuck around till the bitter end with us. If any of you have questions, Kai, I see that you have a question. Please go ahead.
Yes, thanks for this great panel. I have a question for Dr. Parr, and also welcome others panelists to join the discussion. Dr. Parr, you mentioned at the beginning that you want to talk about the relative education and how they would affect the result. And I know this educational expansion happened in almost all those East Asian society and also in Singapore. I wonder how this, when you take into account relative education, how would it affect the result? Thank you.
No, Kai, you raised actually a great question. That's tough. I haven't looked up, but I will actually let Jim and Jayas and Jean actually to answer this question, because I think this is happening not only in South Korea, but to a similar extent, to Japan and China particularly, how this educational category has changed over time. And what does that mean, when we try to look at this educational differential in family behavior? I think this is kind of the huge and important questions.
Yeah, I have thoughts, but I'll defer to Jiao or Jean if you want to share some thoughts about this. The Singaporean context was, those figures were crazy, Jean,
Right.
from 4% to 95%. That's amazing. Yeah.
Yeah, I think, yes. So associated marriage patterns definitely play a big role. This kind of demographic behavior play a big role in family well-being, children's well-being. But, highly educated couples, they tend to marry later. They tend to marry later and have fewer children. And and then that means they are putting more resources for fewer number of children. And as I say, this fewer number of children, higher quality, and then plus these cultural value and extreme high expectation on children's achievement, educational achievement. It all just intensified the differences between children of different groups. So I think definitely this associated marriage trend is going to play a big role. But I want to make a comment on Korea, South Korea, and Japan's pattern. The reason why you guys are seeing a higher never marriage rate for lowly educated men, I think, as Jun pointed out already, a big reason is because of the lack of international marriages. That has just started more recently for Korea and very, very recently in Japan. In the case of Singapore, every year, the annual marriage, right now 37%, and at the one point, it's more than 40% of each year annual marriages are international marriages. And most of them, at least 70–80% of these transnational marriages are between low educated men and women from South Korea, mainly China, Vietnam, and so on. This trend has started much earlier in Singapore. And so in Singapore, we actually don't see the pattern that you guys were talking about, a reversal of education and marriage rate in Korea and Japan. In Singapore, we don't see that. And I think that has a lot to do with this transnational marriages.
Yeah.
Which
I'll
is
jump. Sorry.
related to education, but not directly what you were asking.
Yeah, I'll be real brief, but I'll jump in, Kai, with an interesting thought on the relative versus sort of nominal educational categorization or classification. We'll get back to Daniel's question in just a second. So one of the things that we've seen in recent years on the topic of assorted mating by education in Japan was something that was really kind of unexpected in a sense, and that is a growing prevalence of hypogamy, female hypogamy. So highly educated women marrying men without without 4-year education. And we're thinking, what's going on here? And I think the real answer to that is reflected in your question, which is that highly educated women in Japan, as a result of growing educational attainment, they're not the same people that they were 20 or 30 years ago. And it's probably the women who counterfactually would not have gotten a higher degree in a previous version of Japan that are getting them now and finding a marriage market comprised of relatively more women. These are the ones more likely to marry down. And I think this is really where in the Japanese context, where the rapid rise in educational attainment is not nearly as pronounced as it is in the other three countries, that we really see these kinds of concerns about relative versus, sort of nominal classifications playing out.
Actually, the variance of the education that is a lot smaller these days, right? Everyone has high education.
Daniel, another question for us?
Yeah, well, I have one big question, maybe a smaller one. I like the welcome to NUS sign that you have behind you, Professor June. Singapore, I've been there. It was the first stop when I was doing my doctoral dissertation research. And I wanted to ask you, is everyone aware that in 2 months we have the Year of the Tiger coming up? One of the main findings from my doctoral dissertation was the zodiacal impact on fertility. The births fall in the Year of the Tiger, they go up in the Dragon. For some reason in Singapore and Malaysia, you have some of the strongest fluctuations anywhere in the world. So actually I'm giving a paper at the PAA on this in April, sort of trying to figure out if COVID is affecting fertility in some way in the short term. Will the tiger interfere with that? And then you got the dragon coming up. So we got a crazy ride. And then in Japan, you've got the fire horse in 2026. So
that'll be interesting. I predict no change. I predict nothing, Daniel. Let's see.
Really? Okay, well, we'll put money on that.
Put money on it, yeah.
Thank you, Daniel. I think everyone is aware of that. And, this year, both fertility rate and marriage rate declined. I mean, last year, 2020, but fertility rate obviously had nothing to do with COVID-19. But marriage rate did have something to do with COVID-19 because, in fact, it's the drop in these transnational marriages that we've been talking about because of visa issues. There's about 18% drop in this transnational marriages. So for sure, next year, even if it is not the Year of Tiger, we're going to see, most likely going to see a dip, another big dip in the fertility rate. So I expect the total fertility rate is going to go down below 1 with that double hammer of, Year of the Tiger and the COVID-19 impact. Although the government has come up with some kind of incentive for every baby born during this time, they're getting at least $3,000 incentive. So we'll have to see what the impact really looks like in Singapore.
All right, thanks. We're at about time here, but I see that Laura has put a question in the box. Laura, would you like to ask the question or would you like me to read it out?
I don't know if you can hear me. We are with internet.
We can hear you.
Okay, thank you. That issue, because it's very difficult to get a bride in Korea and even in Japan. And I spent some time in a year in Vietnam, and I always hear these accusations of kidnapping very poor young ladies, and even there is news about travel agencies that they import their brides to be married in either South Korea or Japan. To what extent that is true, or is just isolated cases? My opinion is that no, it's not. There are not isolated cases.
Yeah, so that was that was a little bit hard to hear, Laura. So maybe I'll just repeat very, very briefly what you asked, and it was about the issue that Jean was talking about, international marriages, and particularly marriages to brides from low-income countries, and the notion or the idea or news that some proportion of these are the result of kidnappings, if you will, or forced migration of young women from poor countries for the purposes of marriage in Japan and Korea. To what extent is that real or not, I guess, is the question. Is that fair, Laura? Is that a fair trend?
Yes.
Okay. Hanjun, thoughts? I have thoughts on this for Japan, but I'll pass it to you first.
Well, I guess there's a, certainly there's a problem, because also, sometimes these women don't get enough information about the potential, the husbands and family in Korea. So I think there was a lots of problem in terms of the, way that this agency actually intermediate this process. And also some of that's actually, the quite unethical and some other issue, but it's not clear to me, like, to what extent is a kidnapping and those kind of the wars seem like, it's hard to actually, for me actually to, how to answer this question. But there was certainly issue about this, the process, so that, and also, I think the one important issue is about the domestic violence of the actually, those families in South Korea, between this, the Korean man and this woman from, the other countries, pretty much I would say probably, to some extent happening is in other country as well, to some extent.
Yeah,
right?
I would, my answer would be almost identical to Hanjun's. I don't think that there's any evidence of kidnapping per se. There is certainly evidence of recruitment of brides from foreign countries, typically lower income countries, Laos, Cambodia, for example, Vietnam, and the women who are recruited, if you will, as brides may not, as Hanjun indicated, have as much information as they probably should have. There's also issues in Japan about people who are deceptively brought into the country for work purposes, and may be seen, depending on how you look at it, as I don't know if kidnap again is the right word, but forced labor, or sort of illegally detained, have their passports taken away. These are women who sometimes get married to Japanese men. So I would say that's probably much more common than sort of a surreptitious kidnapping kind of thing. But I realize the distinctions are pretty fine, I guess. Joe or Jean, any last comments before we wrap things up?
Yes.
Josh should talk about the kidnapping. Go ahead.
Yeah. I don't really know the real situation of the international bride in China, but I think it might differ a little bit from Japan, South Korea, or Singapore, because it's still kind of illegal. We're not a country that welcome the international migration. So because of the illegal issues, and usually it might also involve some other illegal actions like women trafficking or something else. I learned from the media some tragedies might happen to those brides, right, from South Asia or somewhere else, right? So I think it might differ by the social context.
And in Singapore, it's this is highly scrutinized, but of course foul plays there. But in fact, the rhetoric goes that some of these foreign brides are taking advantage of these poor, low education, lowly educated males too. So it goes both ways. But I think in general in Singapore, it's like the law scrutinize these marriages, including interviews and to see if these are fake marriages and so on. So.
Okay, I think that we're past time right now, so we're going to unfortunately have to wrap it up. I'm glad we at least had 15 or so minutes for this good conversation, and I'd like to thank Hanjun, Jia, Jean, so much for joining us, particularly Jia. It's so early in the morning. Thank you for being here, and for those of you who have been with us throughout here, Daniel, Kai, and others. Thank you for joining us. I hope this provided a useful initial overview of what's going on with respect to family change and socioeconomic differentials in these countries. And hopefully we'll have many other opportunities to share this with you in the months and years to come. Hopefully in person. So very much looking forward to that. Thank you again, everybody. Thank you, Anna, for taking care of us so well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jim, for organizing the session.
Absolutely. Thanks for
Thank
being
you,
here.
Jim. Yeah.
Yes.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.